So before we do anything with our JSON here, let's structure our app project here the way that we should structure it. Okay. So inside of our package here, I'm going to right click. Let's create a few packages. Let's start with util package. So all the utility classes will go there. I'm going to add a component package, data, model, and because we are going to need all of these, let's put repository, and I'm going to add screens, even though we're going to have just one screen, but it's always a good idea to have such structure and such. Okay, so I'm going to also add network, because we're going to have some classes dedicated to network. And because we are going to have, and also because of dependency injection, I'm going to say DI, where we can put our app model and so forth. Okay, so this should be good for now. And if we need to add anything else, we can come and create here. Now we need to create a model class that will model after a single question, or a single trivia question, if you will. Okay, so we understand that a trivia question would have, of course, the question, category, answer, and of course a list containing all of the possible choices, all of the possible answers. Now we could just create a data class and mimic all of this, but the best way to do so is to use a tool. So if you go to Android Studio, if you click, let's say, inside of a model, that's where we're going to do. What I can do here, I can say right click, I'm going to say new. You should get this Kotlin data class file from JSON. Okay, it's a really handy tool that allows us to actually get or extract the data model, or models in this case, that represents our data class, that is. So if you click here, there are two options, right? You could go ahead and copy the entire payload as such and then add it here. But there's also another option if you don't want to copy this entire payload, because it could be too much. As you see, this is a really long file. And so we can actually get the URL. So copy that URL, right click. I'm going to say retrieve from content from HTTP URL. So click that. And here's where we paste that URL, okay, where we have our JSON. Say OK. I'm going to take a little bit. So it pulls in the entire payload. As you see, it has a lot of information. Okay. And now we have to add a class name, right? So that will represent this one entity of a question and so forth. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and say question like this. Okay. Let's go ahead and say generate. And the beauty of all of this, let's say add, also add. And the beauty of all of this, you may not need to do that, by the way. That is from Git, because I have a Git repository attached to this project. Okay, so the beauty of all of this for a few moments is that if you look at our model there, you can see we have two classes. If you click on this far, the first one says class question and expects an array list of question item. And then we have question item itself. So this is a data class. So the tool that we use went ahead and looked at the entire tree of this JSON here and separated these two classes. So it created this question item data class, as you see here. And you can see it follows exactly this payload here, right? So for each item, for each, let's say, question per se, right? If you see here this object, we have a question, category, answer, and choices as a list. So we have answer, although the order is different, but that doesn't matter. So we have question, we have choices, category, and list. And look at choices here. It's a list of string, which is exactly how it's set up for each one of these objects. So this is good. And we didn't have to do anything. All we had to do was just to pass the URL to our JSON payload. And then the tool went ahead and created, and it knew also how to create those two items, those two model classes. The question here, which is an array list of question item, and question item, the item itself, which contains, it's a data class, which has all of these properties in the constructor. There we go. So we don't have to do anything. Now we have our model classes, which we're going to use to then extrapolate the data we want and to show in our user interface at a later time, of course. Now the idea is to use these model classes and retrieve the information from our API, which is this world.json, which is this JSON payload here. Now, for us to be able to then parse or first connect to this remote URL and get this information here, right? We need to, of course, have the infrastructure ready for that to happen, which means we need to be able to connect to the URL and in the background get this information, all of this, and parse it all and use that data. There are a lot of ways to do what I just mentioned, which is to parse some data from somewhere, in this case a remote server of such, and get that information and make it so that it actually makes sense in our application, right? So to convert all of this into objects that we can call and say, question, give me the answers or the choices or the question and so forth, right? How do we do that? Now, as I said, there are different ways to do this and different libraries that allows us to do this networking. We're going to use one that is very popular called Retrofit. And I really encourage you to actually, whenever you need such transaction, which is to go and fetch data from the internet, API and so forth, and get that data so we can use in our applications, I really recommend you to use Retrofit, which is an HTTP client for Android and Java. So now, as with anything in development, certain things may take a little bit to get used to because of the setting up, but also the way you need to set things up or the classes that you need to use from this library to get things working. But the great thing is that Retrofit is really simple to use in a sense once you get the hang of it, because the idea is not to complicate things. The idea is actually to uncomplicate the process of doing HTTP calls, HTTP network calls. So you may imagine trying to get information using HTTP requests and so forth on Android. If we were to do ourselves, it's very possible. It's been done many times. I've done it, but it takes a lot of effort because you may have to deal with some lower level classes and understand how HTTP requests are called and how to parse the information and so forth. So it's a lot of work. Now with Retrofit, most of that work is actually abstracted out, so we don't have to worry about the underlying processes. All right, so as you see here, this is an example. It says here Retrofit turns your HTTP API into a Java interface, which is really important, as you see here. So for instance, as an example, you have a GitHub service here, and you want to go and get all the repos for a certain user. This is how you do it. So you see there is this annotation at get, and you pass here the path, right, to where you want to get this information. It's repos, and then you have a function here called list repo, and it's a call type, as you see, and expects a list of repos and so forth. So this is just an example, right? And you pass the user, in this case the user that you want to get the repos for, and it shows here how to instantiate or generate an implementation of our GitHub class there. So it's fairly easy once you understand how it works. In this case, I'm creating a Retrofit object, and I'm actually invoking the builder there method, and I pass the base URL, this base URL, and I build. So I use that object, Retrofit object, and pass it along the GitHub user along with our service, and then I'm done. So now I have that service I can use anywhere to do things like service that list repos and get that information. Okay, so as you know, to use it, then we have to configure our project. So let's go to our Retrofit configuration here. Now, there are a lot of things that are happening in the backend as Retrofit goes and gets the data, right? Parses and so forth. So you will see that we'll need a few other So that way we're able to get this information, right, into an actual object that is known to us in our code as something like question or question item. So that's why you see here, we need to do a lot of converting. We'll be able to go through that. But one of the libraries we're going to be using for serialization is JSON. I'm just giving you some of the things that we need to think about or we will cover to get Retrofit to work for us. All right, so if you scroll down, you can see here there are two ways to set up Retrofit in our project. There is the Maven, which we're not going to be using, and there's the Gradle, which is something that we would use, right? You can see here, we've seen this before. So what we need to do really is to copy this line there and go to our project. Let's go to Gradle scripts. Let's go to this one here, the app. And what I usually like to do, you've seen me now, I'm just like to say retrofit like this and paste it all in. And we need to pass the actual retrofit version, the latest version there. What I usually do, I go to view GitHub, I right click, open a new tab. So this is where this lives, this library. And if you scroll down, you can see here it says Square Retrofit 2, Retrofit 2.90. So that is the version that is current at this point and should work. So I'm going to copy that and go back and add it there as such. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and sync. So we need something else, right, for it to work. We need what we call the JSON converter. So going back to the Retrofit documentation here, I can scroll down or up in this case. Let's see. Right, so we have converters here, and there are a few options to get the serialization library. So we're going to get this JSON there. So I'm going to copy this, go back to our code. I'm going to say implementation. And then, of course, I need to pass the version 2.9.0. And let's go ahead and sync. Okay, so it seems like all is good, and we should be good to go with Retrofit.